As Munich reels from a shooting rampage, police say there is no evidence the attacker had links to ISIL or refugees as initially assumed. So we ask, why do some Western media quickly point the finger at Islamic groups? And how does that shape public opinion and fuel Islamophobia? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. It's the third major attack in Europe in just a few days. Munich in southern Germany, the scene of the latest shooting. At least 10 people killed in a crowded shopping mall before the 18-year-old gunman turned the gun on himself. The motive of the German student of Iranian origin remains unclear. Police say the shooting is not an act of terrorism, but it exposes yet again the enormous security challenges facing Europe.
Our perpetrator was 18 years old, born in Munich and raised here. He is a student. The room he lived in has been examined. There is no reference to any relation to ISIL. In his room, documents were found on the topic of spree killing, a topic he had intensively dealt with.
So the German Chancellor Angela Merkel has vowed that the authorities will do everything they can to keep the public safe.
Wir alle.
We are all, and I'm saying this on behalf of the whole federal government, mourning with a heavy heart for those who will never return to their families. For many relatives whose lives might seem empty and meaningless now, I want to express my condolences. We share your sorrow, we're thinking of you, and we're suffering with you. Our thoughts also go to those that are wounded. May they heal quickly and receive all the support they require.
Let's introduce our panel. Joining us from Berlin is Philipp Rotmann. He's the Associate Director of the Global Public Policy Institute. Over in Beirut, we have Habib Battah. He's the Editor-in-Chief of the Beirut Report. Thanks for being with us on Inside Story. Habib, so the police chief in a press conference on Saturday was saying that the Munich attack appears to be a classic shooting rampage and not terrorism. But even before the identity of the attacker was revealed, some Western media quickly jumping to the conclusion that this could be the work of an Arab, this could be the work of a Muslim tied some way to an extremist group. Why do you think that assumption is made so quickly, time and time again?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I remember hearing was a CNN anchor saying that we're not sure if he's an Islamic terrorist or not. And just to use that word, you know, Islamic terrorist, and also we've seen Fox News say things like Muslim terrorist. And I think there's a real problem when we use an ethnic group or a religious group as an adjective for violence, because we're basically ignoring everything about this person. We're basically creating a category of violence that's very convenient to political narratives. And so just to say that, you know, this person is it a classic terrorism or is it Muslim terrorism? Is he a regular human sociopath or is he a Muslim sociopath? And so we're basically saying, is he Muslim or is he human? And it's a very dangerous kind of categorization of people that we see time and time again in these attacks.
Philipp Rotmann, the main focus of the conversation right after the attack took place in Munich was whether this person had any links to ISIL. Instead of trying to address the root problems and the root causes why, and ask the question about why these attacks take place. So why do you think the focus is on whether it's related to ISIL or not?
Well, I don't know, Dareen. I'm sorry why this is the case. I must also say it was probably more the case in international media than it was in the German media. I mean, I watched German TV all last night and followed all the major news outlets on Twitter and on the internet. And I think people reported in German. People reported pretty responsibly, and it took the media, I think, 3 or 4 hours to kind of, you know, suggest anything like a possible Islamist terror background, and partly because the authorities were also very careful in reporting about that. But I guess in terms of the international media, the less information you have about the details and the less access you have to information about the details, the more likely you are to simply put things into a pattern. And since we've already seen one lone wolf attacker who clearly did claim and was claimed to be inspired by ISIL. That knife attack on a train in Würzburg, a couple hundred kilometers north of Munich, it kind of made sense probably for the media to simply lump these two together, as well as obviously previous attacks in European cities.
Well, let me ask you this, Philip, because the American media also is now focusing very much on the origins of this 18-year-old, focusing on the fact that he is of Iranian origin. Is that something that is happening in Germany as well, in German media?
Almost not at all. And I think the evidence also supports that he's I mean, what the latest press releases from the police, the latest information, all support this sense of a mentally unstable 18-year-old who was bullied in school, who started glorifying past mass attacks. There's one in particular in a southwestern German town where a student in 2009 killed 14 or 15 of his fellow students in a mass shooting, which he seems to have glorified according to the stuff that the police found in his apartment, in his parents' apartment. And so the fact that he was part German, part Iranian, clearly does not seem to play a major role. Most of his victims were also immigrant youth. I think some Turkish, some Kosovar immigrants were named by the police. There is clearly no connection to either the ideology or the modus operandi of ISIL.
Habib, no doubt, though, that the role media plays a very important role in shaping public opinion, specifically when it comes to Arabs and Muslims. Now, Philipp is saying that the German media has acted extremely responsibly, but we don't see that responsibility elsewhere, and specifically in Western media. What is the role of the media when it comes to fueling Islamophobia and shaping opinion against Arabs and Muslims?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to note that even the coverage that's been careful has also been careful to say this is not refugees, this is not, he's not Muslim. It's interesting who is deciding who is Muslim and who is not Muslim. Who is deciding what is the degree of being Muslim? Why can't we say that this guy is not Muslim? So there's also this desire to categorize, to put people into a category. There are normal individuals and there are deranged Muslim individuals. There are deranged normal people, there are deranged Muslims. And there's a difference, and so we stop kind of analyzing at that point. It's the responsibility, I think, of the media to really take each case seriously and to look into the details of each case. And so when it comes to a mass shooting in the United States carried out by a white Christian American, we don't really, we look further. We want to know what this person, how this person behaved. We're quick to talk about mental illness and and those kind of issues. When it comes to saying that they're Muslim, then that just provides a stopping point for us not to actually go further. So now we want to say that this person is not Muslim, therefore we have to go further and understand his life. He's not a refugee, so we have to go further and understand what happened, why this happened. So we don't do that same kind of search when we believe that the person is a Muslim. And so that's, I think, a real abdication of our responsibility as journalists, because this is a huge issue of concern. We need to be specific and detailed and do the homework and follow up on these cases. I'll also say that, in past cases where there have been Muslims or even people who are affiliated to some of these groups, we still don't ask more questions. Okay, they're affiliated to this group, but what other background do they bring to the table? How long have they been part of this group? A lot of these people, we know they were not very pious Muslims. They were drinking, they were fighting, they were doing all kinds of things that we kind of easily forget about once we say, well, in this year the person joined this group, so let's not talk about his past, let's forget about his whole identity. I think the main problem is that as journalists, we fail to complicate identity. We fail to understand that, there's a lot of factors that go into why somebody behaves the way they do, and we still don't really understand why criminals act the way they do. But we can look at family background, we can look at socioeconomic background.
But why is it, Habib, that these questions are not being asked in the majority of media?
That neighborhood had been vilified.
You bring up a couple of good points, but I'd just like to know why, in your opinion, these questions are not being asked.
I think because we look for simplistic narratives. Our media is being used to having quick stories, a few sound bites here and there. We don't really want, but also it's politically convenient. I think we don't want, there's a bigger Islamophobia, there's an Orientalism that stretches back generations, and it's still with us today that makes us believe that when we say the word Muslim, that's really enough to explain something. And now that we're saying he's not Muslim, now let's go further and try to understand what he is. And at the same time, when we're being careful too, we also carefully say, you know, in these news reports and CNN and other news outlets, they're also saying that, well, these other terrorist attacks happened previously. So their background, the context that they give to the storytelling, still tells us that, you know, we're still desperately trying to link this person to the Muslim terrorism story. And I think we're really failing our viewers when we're not doing our homework and following up on these cases and just kind of stopping short. It reminds me a lot in the American press, in the early American press, when there was a crime, we would say African American in parentheses, or black, you know, somebody, you know, X person killed somebody, black in parentheses. This is a very racist kind of way of the media operating. And we're seeing a kind of this coming back up again, you know, whereas the one adjective that this person, that he's Muslim, explains everything. We fail to look at the other details. And it is linked to a deeper Islamophobia in the media discourse and a deeper political convenience that is going on right now in the Republican convention and other places where there is a desire to find one bad guy, to focus on that. When actually the numbers tell us a different story. The numbers tell us that are dangers to us from shooting and psychopaths, you know, with weapons comes from, you know, white, you know, normal American citizens, and we're not really concerned with that as a danger in our lives. We want to focus on this one danger, regardless of the math, regardless of the actual risk and the number of people who are out there with weapons. So I think that we should be looking at the commonality between these killers in the U.S., whatever their religion is, and looking at how people access these weapons and have this kind of psychopathic kind of, or, you know, disturbed visions of killing people. I think that's the bigger commonality, and to go away from this idea of, you know, what the person's grandfather's religion was.
Okay, Philip, I see you shaking your head to some of the points that Habib. Yes, go ahead. Go on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on these points, but I think it's also important to see that I think some of these media dynamics are simply the result. I mean, I wouldn't disagree that there is part of the media in the West and in the US and in various other countries, including in Germany, perhaps to some extent, for whom it is convenient to blame Muslims or to blame particular groups. But there's also, I think, a far less conspirational effect going on that even liberal media, even you know, culturally open media fall prey to, and that is simply the problem that in all of these cases there are hours and hours in which you don't have reliable, credible evidence of what happened. And so people need to fill that time and talk about theories, about possible angles, make historical comparisons, and pick out the ones that probably, I mean, cynically as it is, sell the most airtime or the most copies or the most advertisements. I think it's also interesting that there's this huge focus today globally on this attack in Munich that 10 people, tragic as it is, 10 people fell prey to, while there seems to be slightly less attention on the attack in Kabul that happened this morning, if I'm correct, that killed many more, and that might have much more serious political implications if it is true that this was IS in Afghanistan.
Okay, so why is there more focus,
there are numerous
Philipp,
biases coming together here.
Why is there more focus on attacks that take place, for example, in Munich, in Nice, in Brussels, much more so than what happens in Afghanistan and in Iraq?
I think we associate Europe with you know, with peace and with not terrorist attacks taking place, while we have, at least in Europe, I think we have this unfortunate preconception that the normal news out of the Middle East, the normal news out of Afghanistan, is one of terror and violence, because that is what we get from the media, and we obviously overlook the many millions of people who are able to live a normal life and don't necessarily always experience terrorist attacks in Beirut or in Kabul. So I think it's you know, it is the big contrast to what our image of Europe is, and in that sense it is also I think, acceptable and important news to be reported, because it is a period in which Europe is waking up from a somewhat naive trust in that the problems of the world somehow happen out there, and we are somehow safe of these things. That's not true, and Europeans need to come to grips. They are coming to grips right now with the fact that there is no absolute security, neither through security forces, security institutions, some sort of mass surveillance or anything like that, or through having this fabulously attractive liberal society. I think both of these misleading dreams have had quite an effect over Europeans in past decades, and have contributed to a certain aloofness from the world, which is being shattered these days.
I'd like to talk about security in a moment, but Philipp, let me stick with you for a second, because Habib brought up a point which I think is quite important, and he's talking about political capitalization, basically. So stories like this, like what happened in Munich, it does have the habit of spreading beyond borders. It'll spark debates on issues like refugees, like immigration. So to what extent, though, do political parties and officials use the media and hijack the news to serve their own purposes?
Sure they do, and we've seen that I would like to reiterate that I want to be very careful not to blame the German politicians at large, because I think people have been very, very careful and very responsible last night and this morning.
We're not talking strictly about German politicians, but even when you look at what happened after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France, you saw politicians, far-right politicians in the Netherlands and France, they came out and had a very anti-immigrant, anti-refugee policy. So it's not solely Germany we're talking about.
Exactly, and when there is an IS connection like in France and in Belgium, it is obviously much easier to use and utilize these situations for a far-right, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim agenda. And that's what's happening all the time. And of course, right-wing parties across Europe are benefiting from that, tapping into that, simply the politics of fear among people, which is entirely irresponsible, but I wonder if there's any effective way against that.
Is there an effective way against that, Habib, in your opinion?
The most effective way is not to exploit people and to try to take things as they are. I mean, to explain the situation as a shooter, a bomber, a person who is a killer, but not to go to the point of adding adjectives like religion that don't really tell you anything, because that category is way too big to have any meaning. And so I also want to go back to this point about the fact that we consider places like Afghanistan and places in the Muslim world as already dangerous. So we don't really have to cover those areas, because that's how they live over there. That's what they're used to. That's, I think, a really big mistake that we make. Is how, and that also feeds into why we think that this is targeted toward the West. It's actually targeted toward the Muslim world too. Most of the brunt of these attacks is being felt by Muslims, by places like here in Beirut, where we're seeing a lot of attacks, much more than other places. And most people are dying are Muslims. And I think the failure to see that makes us believe in the West that this is just toward us. This is attacking us. This is a religious war against us. When actually, because they don't know, because we have also, there is an Orientalism that tells us that these kind of places, that's how they live. Whatever happens in Africa, for example, well, it's in Africa. So we don't care about it. So there's a problem there with our understanding of the rest of the world. Our understanding that tells us that we are somehow safe, that we are somehow normal, that we are somehow not part of these wars, when actually Western governments play a big role in these wars. We fail to investigate that. That's part of our socialization that lets us think that this is a religious war, a holy war. We have to start being specific as journalists, stop using these easy labels like Muslim terrorist, Islamic terrorist, and think more about the individual circumstances.
And Habib, right, when these words are used in the media, when these words are used in the media and used so quickly, how does this actually play into the hand of those who are indeed extremists like ISIL?
Yes, I mean, and so they're playing into the hands of those politicians who want to exploit people's fears, want to capitalize and unite people behind one fear. That's a simple political issue. And when that politician comes out and starts saying anti-Muslim things, then that actually, it feeds a vicious cycle of the people who are extremists saying that, look, there is reason to be extremists. We have a right to be extremists. We have to face this idea. So they're getting the other end of the propaganda, which says that this is a religious war as well. So it's actually a self-realization, to call it religious war over and over again, you are making it a religious war.
Philipp, when you look at the attack in Munich specifically, and now we know that it was a lone wolf attack, at least that's what the police chief and the prosecutor are saying. But when it comes to security, how difficult is it for lone individuals to be identified in the context of what's happening in Europe and the bigger attacks claimed by ISIL that are going on? So this poses a real challenge for European security, doesn't it?
I think that does pose a huge risk, a huge challenge to the security services, and also to the population in terms of the crossroads that European societies are really at right now. Because regardless of the facts, the media climate and the political climate that mixes these true Islamist inspired, these really IS organized attacks and these lone wolf attacks that have nothing whatsoever to do with international terrorism into one big mix of fear right now. And for security services and for politicians, the challenge is how to manage, how to reassure the population, and how to manage that process in which European societies need to figure out how to go forward, how to preserve their openness and their freedoms while transitioning from this somewhat naive sense of total safety and security to a more realistic sense in which we have to emotionally and psychologically arrive at the place where we realize that rationally there is just no way to prevent any and all terrorist attacks or lone wolf shootings. If someone doesn't have a major criminal record, and even if he has some sort of a criminal record, there is no way any security service or any police service would be able to track all these people all the time. We know that in Germany and in France and in Belgium, the police has even had trouble covering, surveilling a small number, hundreds or small numbers of thousands of known Islamist extremists who have expressed interest in militancy and terrorism before. So while there are improvements to be made, and there are improvements being made right now to fix these capacity gaps with regard to people who do express personal allegiance to international terrorist organizations and who are preparing specific attacks. This is not anything that can be done for lone wolves or mass shooters such as the guy last night in Munich.
Do you agree with that, Habib? And how can countries in Europe specifically find the balance between security on one end and freedom on the other?
We're more free, we're more secure when we give less ammunition to extremists. When we take less policies that exclude, we take more inclusive policies. Those are the worst enemy of, I like to see, for example, the Canadian Prime Minister talking about a Ramadan message and the way that he tried to even pronounce the words, and showing that not only is he recognizing there's another class or another group in his society, but that he tries to learn about that group and tries to make that mainstream. And we saw that with the Jewish American population. That has been very useful to for Americans to understand Jewish holidays, to understand and make it more, less mystified, and have this mystique around who are these strange people. So we need to see a reaching out, I think, from the highest levels of leadership to understand communities. And I think even when it's ISIS related, that doesn't remove our responsibility to understand the individuals who committed the crime and to treat this as any other news story, to do the hard investigative groundwork to find out what's going on, to find out how many actors are involved, and how this actually happened, how these individuals came to accept IS.
Right.
And we're seeing very kind of different range of connections, and whether they're a card holding member or they've seen a video, etc. I mean, so either way, we still need to do our job and kind of look into those people and see what can we do as a society, what problems and challenges that person face.
Right.
That, you know, we don't want to say that, you know, it's an automatic condition of violence, but we want to reduce the factors in society and show a mainstream level, a very high political level of reaching out.
Okay, Habib, thank you very much. On that note, I'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Habib Battah and Philipp Rotmann, for joining us. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From myself and the whole team here in Doha, goodbye for now.